Hello, this is Just Listen, hosted by George. Today is October 20th, 2025. Welcome to the podcast. Today, I want to talk about the U.S. federal government policy on the ceasefire of the Hamas and Israel war. This is very important because I listened to the remarks that the president of the United States made when they were in Israel a week and a half or so ago. What I noticed is that when the president is talking about what happened, what caused the ceasefire, some of the mainstream media always points out the mistakes and etc. and puts the spin on there without actually listening to what the president and what the Israelis are really saying. So the ceasefire, bottom line, was caused because of the strategy that the Israelis and the U.S. administration used. And you'll only hear this on the podcast because the focus should be on how they reach their objectives. And without knowing that, you're going to think, well, the negotiations worked and you can talk to them enough and they'll be reasonable. No, they were not reasonable, meaning Hamas. So let's dig in here and I will explain what I'm talking about. So the Israelis, when all this kicked off on October the 7th, within 5 days, the Israelis had initiated a large-scale military offensive in the Gaza Strip with the stated goals of destroying Hamas, securing the release of the hostages, and ensuring its future security. Most of you probably had some kind of idea of that from the sound bites, but let's dig in even further. Israel's execution of the war involves several military tactics and operations. Airstrikes. Israel began its offensive with massive airstrikes on targets within Gaza. These attacks have been widespread and have hit targets, infrastructure, etc. I paused for a second because no matter where you get the information, it already leans you toward that they do things wrong. But the airstrikes are important. Every war or conflict, let's call them conflicts, that the U.S. has been involved in involves the same thing because you're going to see the pattern. The biggest one was being during the Gulf War when I was in the service. Okay, so the next one is ground invasion. After initial airstrikes, Israeli forces launched a ground invasion into Gaza. This has involved the use of tanks, armored personnel, carriers, and bulldozers. So, control the air, and then you have to put ground forces into the affected area. They also did military raids. Israeli forces have conducted raids into various parts of Gaza, including Gaza City and specific neighborhoods. What they were looking for were the terrorists. So, on the flip side, when they did the ground invasion, that actually initiated one of the most important parts of the strategy to put boots on the ground and then to conduct urban warfare pretty much in the area because the adversary, Hamas, had dug up all of these bunkers the last 10 years and they were hiding amongst the general population. So the Israelis had to go in there through like a ground invasion and to get them, roust them out, or make them leave the area. Civilian evacuations. Israel has issued warnings and ordered civilians to evacuate from certain areas, particularly in northern Gaza, ahead of the major ground operations. Why? Because they knew that that's where Hamas was. Hamas actually had a strategy, and a lot of those forces were in northern Gaza. And again, you have to have the ground invasion. You have to go in there. Words alone just won't do it. Now, they made the civilians leave because when you have your adversary in the urban warfare amongst the civilian population, you have to get them out and go house to house, building to building, and you have to go after them and in the same time get the civilians out of the area, because that's very important. You don't want high amounts of civilians getting killed because your adversary is in their midst and their strategy is to make them targets so that they can get on the news and say that you're killing innocent civilians. Next one is blockade and denial of aid. Israel has been accused of deliberately inflicting conditions that have led to widespread Okay. So what it should have said is that the strategy was blockade and denial of aid. They were doing that with water, electricity, and fuel. The reason that they were doing that is it would force Hamas to the table, because Hamas's strategy was to use the people to get their will and to stop the Israelis from coming after them. Now, they did substantial land incursions. The ground invasion has been characterized as deliberate and gradual advancements. So they went into Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Rafah. Those were the strongholds because, like I've said a couple of times here, Hamas's strategy was the underground bunkers, hold the hostages there, and keep the Israeli military from conducting operations, the urban operations, because air superiority will only give you so much, right? Because the buildings were all bombed probably within the first 48 hours that they started. Now, there was a subterranean warfare. Central element of the conflict has been extensive and complex tunnel network used by Hamas, like I've told you. So the defense forces had to rapidly evolve their subterranean combat strategy to address this challenge, requiring coordinated action between conventional and special operations unit and above and below ground. If you will remember, because the mainstream media only talked about it for a second, they were miles and miles of tunnels. And pretty much what Hamas would do is lay low in the tunnels, then at certain times come out and kill, and then go back in the tunnels. So subterranean warfare is something different that most nations have never had to get involved in. During one of the conflicts in Asia, Vietnam War, places like that, the adversaries of the United States were doing tunnels. So I suppose that Hamas used that to further their objectives. All right, so here is what the U.S. did. So, because I went out and it took me a while to find the what he exactly said. All right, so Trump talked about intervention that helped with the negotiation of a ceasefire. So that intervention was what the Israelis did. That was part of a strategy that forced Hamas out, providing weapons to Israel. That was another important one because Israel needed the weapons or to replenish the weapons. A lot of that was just bullets. When you're waging war, you use a lot of bullets, and they had to be replenished. There were some other things too, but a lot of that stuff is classified. But I do know that they need bullets. Then the U.S. used the peace plan with what the Israelis had done. And when they were in these meetings, they told Hamas, we've got the air, we control the ground, and if you do not stop and give back the hostages, we're going to sweep with our ground forces and we're going to repel you from the Gaza Strip in its entirety. And with that, they use the brokered peace plan, which include a ceasefire and a path to transition Gaza's governance. And the main piece of that is, based on the strategy that I told you about, is Hamas cannot be in control. And also, the way that they implemented the plan was to get the hostages back first. Then you go into the phase 2 portion of that, and you disarm them, which is going to be pretty tough because, as you've seen on the news bites, they're already pushing back. Another thing that the Trump administration did was weaken Iran's military capabilities. Now, if you will remember, they bombed bunkers in Iran's nuclear facilities. Why did they do that? Well, the president kind of alluded to the fact that the Hamas was getting help from Iran, and potentially, if the Iranians ever got a nuclear weapon, that could affect the war with Israel and Hamas by creating an atmosphere where Iran could have actually dropped some kind of bombs on Israel. So that was very important. And in general, the negotiations in themselves do not end wars. If you look at the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and then you look at the Ukraine and Russia, those are two different war strategies. And I'm going to talk about Ukraine again next week. The mainstream media makes it look like that if you talk to people long enough, they will agree. That is just not true. You have to have a strategy of taking over the affected land through ground troops, through air superiority, and also that subterranean warfare that I was talking about to force the adversary to give up. And that's what wins wars. And the whole point of this podcast is that with these sound bites from the mainstream media, they are given the impression that all you gotta do is just keep talking and that the other side is willing to negotiate. That is just not true. And no war that I know of has ever been won like that. People need to get the facts and the details that there was a definite strategy and that Hamas was forced to do the ceasefire. This is Just Listen, hosted by George. Let me know what you think.